Over the last 5 episodes, we've used ATT and CK, NIST's Zero Trust Model, STRIDE, and attack trees to analyze exactly what went wrong at Kestrel Health. In real depth, here's a question none of those tools answer. What made sure someone at Kestrel actually ran any of this analysis in the first place, on a schedule, as a normal part of how the organization designs systems, rather than depending on it happening only after a 6-week intrusion made it unavoidable? That's not a technique question. It's a framework question. And it's where this episode and this arc ends. If you've watched the TOGAF season, you already know the ADM cycles through business, data, application, and technology architecture phases. Security isn't one of those phases. It's treated as a cross-cutting concern, meant to be addressed within each phase as the architecture team works through it, rather than owning a dedicated phase of its own. That's a deliberate design choice, not an oversight. TOGAF is built to be broadly applicable across every kind of architecture work an enterprise might need, and a security phase, detailed enough to satisfy a security specialist, would need to be extensive enough to bloat the core method for the many organizations and projects that don't need that depth on every engagement. The practical consequence is real, though. An organization running plain TOGAF without more specific guidance can vary enormously in how rigorously security actually gets addressed at each phase, because cross-cutting concern leaves a great deal of room for a team to underinvest in it, if nothing more concrete forces the issue. Kestrel's architecture team would have described their process as TOGAF aligned. Nothing about that description tells you whether anyone ever asked the specific question that mattered. Was the trust relationship between the billing and scheduling services ever actually reviewed by anyone at any phase? In practice, the phases where security tends to surface most concretely are Phase B, business architecture, where security requirements first get captured as business drivers, and Phase D, technology architecture, where those requirements get translated into actual technical controls. The gap sits precisely in the phases between those two, Phase C, data and application architecture, where trust relationships between components typically get decided, often implicitly, by whichever engineers happen to be building the components, well before anyone revisits whether those decisions match what Phase B actually required. None of this means TOGAF handled security badly at Kestrel. It means TOGAF, used alone, never actually forced the specific question that would have caught the gap. A different claim, and an important distinction to hold onto through the rest of this episode. O-ESA, Open Enterprise Security Architecture, is a companion guide, also published by the Open Group, the same body behind TOGAF. It exists specifically to give architects concrete guidance for embedding security architecture work into the ADM phase by phase, rather than leaving address security as an unstated expectation. What it actually adds is policy-driven guidance, showing how a security policy should trace through each ADM phase into concrete technical controls, along with templates for the kind of artifact a security-conscious ADM cycle should actually produce at each stage. Concretely, O-ESA organizes its guidance around a security policy hierarchy. A small number of high-level principles progressively refined into specific testable requirements as they move through the ADM, so that by Phase D, a principle like internal services must not implicitly trust each other has become a specific, checkable requirement, rather than an aspiration nobody's quite sure how to enforce. That refinement discipline, principle down to specific testable requirement, is the part most organizations skip when they try to bolt security onto TOGAF informally. And it's exactly the part O-ESA exists to formalize. Framed simply, If TOGAF gives you the general method, O-ESA is the same publisher's answer to how do I make sure security doesn't quietly fall through the cracks of that method, rather than a separate framework competing with it. An organization already committed to TOGAF, looking for the most natural next step to close this specific gap, generally finds O-ESA before it finds anything else, precisely because it was written to slot directly into the ADM they're already running. SABSA, the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, developed by John Sherwood, David Linus, and Andrew Clark, isn't a TOGAF companion at all. It's a fully independent, security-native architecture framework, built from the ground up around security and risk rather than adapted from a general enterprise architecture method. Its structure is a layered matrix, similar in spirit to Zachman's. Contextual, conceptual, logical, physical, component, and operational layers, crossed against 6 questions asked at every layer. What, why, how, who, where, and when. The genuinely distinctive strength sits in that matrix. SABSA insists every security control trace back through it to an actual business attribute or driver. Not, we added encryption because it's best practice, but we added encryption because the business specifically requires this property, decomposed down through the layers to this exact control. Concretely, at the contextual layer, the why question might surface a business driver like patient trust depends on data confidentiality. By the time that same driver has been decomposed down to the component layer, the how question produces something as specific as mutual TLS between the billing and scheduling services with certificate-based identity. The value of the matrix is that you can point at any specific technical control, anywhere in a system, and trace it straight back up to the business reason it exists. And just as usefully, you can point at a technical decision, ask which cell of the matrix justifies it, and discover, as Kestrel would have, that the honest answer for the billing scheduling trust relationship was no cell, nobody ever asked. That traceability is SABSA's real contribution, and in practice, it's stronger than what TOGAF plus O-ESA typically produces on their own, because it forces the business justification question at every single layer, rather than treating it as implicit. How organizations actually combine these in practice. A common pattern runs TOGAF as the overall enterprise architecture method and layers SABSA specifically for security architecture work, mapping SABSA's business attribute-driven layers onto the relevant ADM phases. SABSA's contextual and conceptual layers map naturally onto TOGAF's early architecture vision and business architecture phases, and SABSA's logical, physical, and component layers map onto TOGAF's data, application, and technology architecture phases. The two frameworks aren't actually competing for the same job, which is exactly why organizations running both rarely find them redundant. Worth being honest here, would any of these 3 frameworks, by name, have caught the specific gap that got exploited? No. None of them mandates run a stride session on this specific service boundary. That's a technique, and techniques aren't what frameworks provide. What a properly implemented security architecture practice, built on any of the 3, would have created is the structural condition that makes catching it likely rather than accidental. O-ESA's phase-by-phase guidance would have flagged, has the trust relationship between these 2 specific services been explicitly reviewed as a required artifact at the relevant ADM phase, rather than an assumed non-issue nobody was asked about. SABSA's business attribute traceability would have forced an explicit answer to what business attribute justifies this specific trust relationship. And the honest answer at Kestrel, nobody decided this, it's just how the services happened to get built, would have shown up as a visible, uncomfortable gap on the matrix rather than an invisible assumption nobody had to defend. The deeper point underneath all of this: frameworks don't find vulnerabilities. Stride, attack trees, and AT10CK do that. Frameworks create the organizational structure that makes sure someone is actually looking on a schedule with the right techniques in hand, rather than depending on any one engineer's diligence or the kind of luck that caught Kestrel's exfiltration attempt before it succeeded. It's worth being fair about the cost side of this too, briefly, since we'll cover it properly later in the season. Neither O-ESA's phase-by-phase discipline nor SABSA's full traceability matrix is free to run. Both require real time from people who understand the business well enough to state its actual attributes and drivers, not just its technical requirements, a scarcer skill than pure technical security expertise, and part of why organizations that adopt these frameworks seriously tend to invest specifically in that translation role, rather than assuming a security engineer alone can fill it. 3 mistakes recur. First, adopting a framework as a document to reference during audits rather than a practice actually followed during design work. A SABSA matrix or an O-ESA template sitting unused in a wiki protects nothing. Second, treating SABSA and TOGAF as competitors, forcing a choice between them, when the realistic answer for most organizations doing serious security architecture work is both, applied to different layers of the same problem. Third, underestimating how much sustained organizational discipline any of these 3 actually requires. A framework adopted with real energy during one big transformation project, then left unmaintained as the organization moves on to the next initiative, provides barely more protection a few years later than no framework at all. That closes Arc 1. We've gone from how attackers actually move to why the old perimeter model failed structurally, to the architecture that replaces it, to finding your own design flaws before an attacker does, to understanding how those individual flaws chain into a working attack, to the organizational frameworks that make sure this entire practice actually happens on a schedule rather than by luck. Arc 2 starts exactly where the Zero Trust model left a promise unfulfilled. It said every request gets verified against an identity. It never said what identity actually means, architecturally, or why most organizations get considerably less of it right than they assume. That's next episode. If you're building systems that need to survive being breached, not just avoid it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.